With Trump's sudden departure, was the G7 worth it? In spite of a packed agenda addressing crucial trade issues and the war in Ukraine, conflict between Israel and Iran pulled the most powerful leader away. But was that a bad thing? And what did the G7 really achieve? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the G7. Well, a lot is at stake when the leaders of the world's most developed economies come together, especially when they're facing destabilization via a tariff war and conflict. But this year's G7 meeting was dramatically overshadowed by the abrupt departure of the U.S. president following Israel's attack on Iran. Now, some saw that as a good thing, claiming Donald Trump's counterparts would have fewer distractions and could better relax and focus. But that also meant that key meetings, including between Trump and Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelenskyy, were canceled. So what was achieved? Here's a look.
With the skies over Iran and Israel alight, the war in Ukraine raging, and pressing global economic uncertainties, the G7 summit in Canada had a lot on its plate. But after US President Donald Trump's early departure because of Israel's attacks on Iran, the group failed to announce major agreements. The summit concluded without a joint statement on the Ukraine war, and Trump's meeting with his Ukrainian counterpart was called off. And on the Iran-Israel conflict, the world leaders fell short of calling for a ceasefire and backed Israel.
We affirm that Israel has a right to defend itself. We reiterate our support for the security of Israel. Iran is the principal source of regional instability and terror.
Trump's warnings to Iran have become harsher since his return to Washington. On the economic front, Trump's tariff threats have already caused uncertainty in global markets. And with the July 9 US deadline to impose tariffs approaching, other G7 nations are scrambling to address the issue. The US and the UK did sign a partial trade deal on the sidelines, but the others came away empty-handed. Despite this, the leaders hailed the summit's productivity and downplayed President Trump's abrupt exit.
We had a good G7. I mean, planned were 5 sessions. We've done 4 yesterday in the presence of President Trump.
It was Mr. Trump's opinion that it was better to be in Washington. And I understand. I absolutely understand his decision.
Traditionally, G7 meetings present the opportunity for the heads of the world's most developed economies to navigate collectively in the midst of war's economic turmoil and unpredictability. This time, though, the cracks appear to have widened.
So was an opportunity missed for better G7 cooperation in the face of yet more conflict, or were most G7 leaders actually happy to continue the summit without the U.S. president? Well, joining me now to debate that and much more are from Washington, Director of the Iran Program at the Middle East Institute, Alex Vatanka. From Berlin, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times, Stephen Erlanger. And from Dallas, Republican strategist and managing director at Nest Point Associates, John Thomas. Thanks all so much for being with me. Stephen, you know what? I'm going to start with you because last year, when you covered the G7 in Italy, you praised the sense of solidarity at that meeting. So first tell us how it felt going into the summit actually before, there was any mention of Israel and Iran, and what were you expecting to be the big takeaways at that point?
Well, I remember last year everyone was looking at Joe Biden to see if he was compos mentis or not. They may be looking at Donald Trump for the same question, but in a different way. The big issue, which we expected, was trade. I mean, because obviously Donald Trump has this obsession with tariffs, and the host, Canada, is being hurt by tariffs, let alone the other countries. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to have that discussion. And then, of course, there is always a discussion about Ukraine and Russia, which is more sensitive for Trump. But of course, in this case, the Israeli-Iran war got in the way of everything. And so Trump left early. I mean, how serious conversations he actually had there, it's very hard to know.
So do you think it was still productive on some level?
Well, it's always productive to get these people together, but I think it did, in a way, show the, put it this way, the weakness of a G6 without G1. If G1 isn't very interested, it makes G6 look a bit like it's not relevant. I mean, this was particularly true on Iran, where the fight was over a simple statement calling for de-escalation, and Trump refused to sign it, and then it changed a little bit, and so he was willing to sign it. But clearly, even though most of the countries in the G7 do not want Iran to have a bomb, and actually the EU3 were all there, I mean, and they've worked very hard not to have Iran get a bomb.
Yeah.
Still, support for Israel's war on Iran was a much more delicate issue, and Trump is much more there than the others.
Very quickly, Stephen, I guess the big loss then was not being able to talk about the trade issues, address the tariff war. Was that a big loss?
Well, I think it is a big loss. I mean, partly because the thing about Trump is you've got to talk to him directly. I mean, he's much more than most presidents, follows his own gut, his own obsessions, his own interests. And sometimes it's the last person who actually talks to him that makes a big difference. So he's gone back and forth on tariffs, but this deadline of July 9th is sort of coming for everyone. So I think people did want to get into his ear about the damage being done to their countries, to America's allies, by this policy, and hoping that deals could be done to alleviate the pain.
Right. Alex, let me come to you. I mean, this was an incredibly important time for these leaders to meet. You know, the global economy, as we said, is at stake in huge part because of Trump's tariffs. But in their communique, very little was said about trade. And instead, really, the focus was on calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, but not with Iran. De-escalation was the word used. And again, you know, the joint communique to warn Iran on its nuclear program and repeat that Israel has the right to defend itself. So how does Tehran interpret all that? Because their response matters right now. Their feelings, if I can put it that way, matter.
Right. Well, look, I did not get much of a big reaction from the Iranian sides from the G7. And, you know, they're obviously busy fighting this war now. And then to be honest, I don't think they expected G7 to do anything other than they did. You know, as Stephen just pointed out, there's a long history of U.S. and European support for the state of Israel, and a long history of opposition by the West, not just about Iran's nuclear program, but the nature of the Islamic Republic, the political nature of the regime. So I don't think anybody in Tehran was sitting waiting for some kind of a statement to come out of G7 that would change the course of this war. Where they are at right now, clearly the Iranian side, and we just seen in the last few hours, Ali Khamenei has come out and said Iran will not surrender, which was a response to President Trump's message yesterday about unconditional surrender. So now they're saying they're going to fight this out, but clearly they want a way out of this if they can get a way out of it. And it's not G7 that's going to give them a way out. It's going to be United States. So if I was Iran right now, I will get on that phone and talk to Donald Trump directly, because time is of an essence here, and there's no point in going through the Omanis or anybody else at this point. You need to talk to President Trump, because, you know, it looks like he's moving in the direction of accepting the fact that it might be time to, if he can, get rid of the Islamic Republic in one go. It's a big if, whether he can do that, but that might be exactly where he's going.
Okay, but I mean, did the G7 have an opportunity there to look at where you think he's going and maybe try to moderate that position? Or do you really feel they have no place? It's strictly between Iran and the U.S.?
Yeah, look, it's been happening so fast. I mean, in the course of the last 6 days, President Trump, in the first part of that, this conflict, like first 3 days or so, was still keeping the door of diplomacy open, saying, Iran, I told you, cut a deal with me, come back. And then suddenly, over the last 48 hours, but he shifted course. So I don't think anybody had time to prepare. I mean, if that conversation was to be happening at G7, the leaders just weren't briefed. They weren't prepared. And I'm not even sure if Trump himself would have been prepared to have that conversation. I'm suspecting he's having that conversation yesterday and obviously today in terms of what to do.
Okay. John, you seem to agree with several points that both Alex and Stephen made. So in general, though, I mean, how seriously does Trump take the G7 right now, given all the geopolitical, surroundings at this time? Did it matter for him to be there? I mean, is that why he left? He sees it as irrelevant specifically at this time?
Well, I think him showing up in the first place, he was trying to cooperate with them on the issue of trade. I would have loved to see some more movement, and perhaps had he stayed the whole time and there not been a global conflict, perhaps there would have been more movement. I would say, though, President Trump really isn't negotiating trade deals himself. He's delegated that authority to his Commerce Secretary and Treasury Secretary, and they're flying all around the world to work these deals. So not all hope is lost on the trade side. I think President Trump doesn't believe that he needs the G6 to make his military decisions. And I think the last guest just actually said it really wisely, which is that President Trump himself might not have been fully briefed while he was at the G7 as to what the situation was relating to our intelligence. And that's why he went back to the Situation Room to be briefed. I think that was the prudent decision. Unfortunately, sometimes global events take precedent. And I think President Trump did the right thing to go back and get more intelligence so that he can decide what he wants to do.
Okay. Stephen, hypothetically, if Iran and Israel hadn't happened, one of the main things on the table obviously would have been Ukraine. It wasn't. He didn't even meet with Zelenskyy, and really very little was said about where that issue is going, when just a few weeks ago there was a lot of talk, and particularly from the White House, about where to go with putting further sanctions on Moscow. Do you think Trump was potentially glad to have avoided that because of what happened with Iran and Israel?
Well, he's also got a NATO summit coming up in a couple days, so I think he probably thinks that's a better place for a Ukraine conversation. But it is a pity because Zelenskyy came partly to talk to Trump, and that meeting was canceled, as was Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico's meeting with Trump. So these things are damaging. Now, I hope John is right. I mean, because certainly on the plane coming back from Canada, Trump was reminded that his own head of intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, had testified that there was no evidence Iran was moving toward a bomb, as the Israelis have averred. And Trump said, "Oh, I don't believe that." Right? Yes, they are. So that was kind of embarrassing for America's intelligence agencies, but we'll see what he finally decides. I mean, I do believe that Ukraine is no big surprise right now. The Americans are not talking about any more money for Ukraine. They have said that the Europeans, many of whom were at the G7, should take the burden of responsibility for funding and supplying Ukraine. And I think the Europeans in general are a little more optimistic that they can help get Ukraine through the summer offensive and into next year, so long as America keeps up its operational intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians, which it has done so far. And the fact that Trump is a bit frustrated with Vladimir Putin, his pal, who has not been very interested in talking about a ceasefire, makes a lot of people hope that America will at least continue that kind of intelligence sharing, as well as being quite willing to sell good American equipment to Europeans for Ukraine and to the Ukrainians themselves. So I think Ukraine will come up at NATO, to be sure, and maybe that's the better place for it.
Okay, Alex, is NATO the better place for it, or was there a real opportunity lost with the G7 countries as far as constructing a collective approach to Russia is concerned? Or, I mean, how does Moscow feel about having not been addressed at all and Trump not meeting with Zelenskyy? Are they cheering right now?
All I can tell you, Andrea, is that, if you're Russia right now, a major war in the Middle East involving the United States is obviously the kind of distraction that Russia can benefit from, because, they will have, the eyes won't be on them. They can do more than they have already done in Ukraine. And more specifically on the issue of what G7 could have done on the issue of Iran, I'm not even sure, again, whether there's been a serious conversation because the Israeli attack came from nowhere. United States was getting ready to negotiate with Iran last Sunday in Oman. Even the Secretary General of IAEA just came out yesterday. I was listening on what he said. He said there's no systematic effort by Iran to weaponize that they could detect. So when you don't have time to prepare, the idea that they can sit down and have a kind of a consensus in terms of what to do with a common adversary. The Islamic Republic has been a common adversary for so long, for entirety of the Western Bloc. So that's not a surprise, but you need time after 46 years of the same problem being there to prepare for the day after. I don't see any signs of the day after. In fact, President Macron of France has come out and said, it looks like President Trump is using the language he's using to pressure Iran, and that he also added, I hope they're not going for regime change, something to the effect that, we're not ready for it. The country isn't ready for it. Country meaning Iran. There is no plan B. There is no opposition on the sidelines waiting to take over if the Islamic Republic collapses. So to your point about G7, you just need to, if we compare very quickly to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, we had over a year plus to prepare on all fronts, diplomatically, militarily. None of that is in place right now. So, yeah.
Okay. John, it's pretty commonly known that MAGA loyalists in particular really saw the G7's calls for de-escalation as just weak. Do you feel that opinion actually kind of emboldens Trump more to take some kind of military action on Iran with Israel's cooperation? Is that a bit of what others might see as the danger here?
I'm not sure that the MAGA base really thinks too much about the G7 in terms of their political calculations, but you have hit on a really fascinating rift within the Republican Party, even within the MAGA base. Right now, there isn't consensus in terms of whether or not the U.S. should get involved in a war or remain more isolationist. Traditionally, MAGA has been more isolationist, yet this is really hitting on a core Republican tenet, which is to always support Israel. And so it's a split consensus. Younger MAGA voters tend to be more isolationist and would not like to see the president get involved. Older MAGA voters would like to stand behind Israel, and if Israel says they need support and U.S. involvement, they'd like to see U.S. involvement. That gets even more complicated because President Trump really has run both times on roughly being isolationists. That if it doesn't directly isn't on our shores, we shouldn't care or get involved. And so this really is putting President Trump in a pickle because it goes against his isolationist tendencies. But on the other hand, President Trump has said he does not want Iran ever to have nuclear capabilities. So we don't know quite how this is going to play out. And depending on what decision President Trump makes, it's possible to cause deeper fissures within his own base on the issue.
Interesting. Stephen, there were some analyses, though, that said this summit might actually show how other G7 leaders, or the G6 now, might try to find ways, once he left, to find ways to better maneuver around the United States and what it wants. Because Trump can prove divisive, unpredictable, it might be better to look for ways to work without the U.S. as a partner. Plus, they also said that right now, we kind of have Israel and the United States together doing the G7's dirty work when it comes to Iran. Do you see that at play?
Well, I do. I mean, I thought it was fascinating that Friedrich Merz, the new German chancellor, actually said it. He said Israel's doing our dirty work because, again, Germany, France, Britain have been leaders in trying to prevent Iran from getting a bomb. They're the ones that pushed the first 2015 deal. And I also think John's right. I mean, it's put the Vice President, J.D. Vance, into something of a pickle, too, because he is the most openly, let's not get involved with foreign wars person. And he's had to soften his statements in the last day or two, depending on what Trump wants to do. Now, the whole world is kind of working to some degree around Donald Trump, but also with Donald Trump. No one wants a world without American power. No one wants a world where the President of the United States doesn't have some important thing to say. And I don't think any American president can really be isolationist. If you look at a Gaza problem, if you look at a Ukraine problem, if you look at an Iran problem, in the end, everyone turns to the United States to find some kind of response. So it's impossible to be isolationist. The big question is, how deeply does the United States want to get involved? How much does it want to spend? Does it really want to move toward China? Will it undermine its own presence in Europe, reduce it? Does it create questions of credibility about collective defense for NATO? And what about President Trump's seeming conciliatory position toward Vladimir Putin, no matter what Vladimir Putin does? These are the kinds of things that worry allies, but they don't want to offend the United States or lose its support. So people are trying to maneuver around and with and see where they can work with the United States and where they can do things like in Ukraine on their own.
But Alex, do you think they want or don't want a world without American power? Stephen was saying it's kind of inevitable and that they do still look to the United States for that leadership, but isn't that diminishing?
So the two blocks I look at, let me just start with the Europeans. I certainly sense that the attitude in Europe this time around compared to the first Trump administration is that maybe the problem isn't the Trumpian worldview. Maybe the problem is actually deeper than that. Maybe it's a reflection of the aspirations of the American people, that they're just not committed to that sort of old transatlantic relationship, and that Europe really needs to wake up and not assume that this is a Trumpian phenomena. He'll be in the White House for 4 years, he'll go away, we'll go back to the old days. So Europe started moving in that direction. And there are, in terms of the metrics, we can look at how they're spending on defense, how they're trying to sort of prepare themselves for the moment the United States doesn't want to work closely with the United States. So that certainly seems to be the conversation in Europe. Obviously, it's going to take years, particularly on the defense front. You can't turn around from, overnight and shifting your industrial base towards defense production. It will take time, but it seems to be that's where the Europeans are going, regardless of whether it's Trump in the White House or whether the Ukraine war comes to an end or not. The other block of countries I quickly point out to are the Gulf states. They're in a very precarious place right now. The Gulf states had invested so much in President Trump, thinking he's going to help him out in terms of their economic plans going forward. And right now, they are so nervous that if U.S. gets into a regional war, essentially, with Iran, that they will be at the front line, that they will be paying the prices. Because if this Iranian regime comes to the conclusion that policy of the United States is regime change, then they will throw everything they have at the United States, including U.S. bases and U.S. commercial interests, which are mostly to Iran south in the Gulf states. So that's also another block of states to watch very carefully as we discuss this crisis over Iran.
Okay. John, let me give you the last minute and a half for your final thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question about whether or not the rest of the world kind of is envisioning a world without U.S. power. I just functionally don't see that as possible. I think the particularly President Trump is not worried about what Europe or, quite frankly, the rest of the G6 is thinking on this particular issue. I don't think he's going to take that into his calculus as to what he does or doesn't do. And it was clear that President Trump did want to make a deal with Iran, and the style that he was using was potentially the threat of action if they couldn't come to an agreement. That was his approach. And it might be that Iran is calling his bluff and leaving the president with no option. I see one particular exit for the United States is to provide some of our larger munitions and bombs to let Israel actually deploy those weapons rather than having direct U.S. involvement with troops and whatnot. But the next few days will be very telling as how the president wants to navigate this.
Yeah, that just seems like the no-brainer from Trump's perspective. We're not getting involved in the war. We're just fighting the war via proxy. It seems to be a win-win for Trump especially. Okay, John, that will have to be the final word, unfortunately, for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much, really, for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.